The presentation you are about to hear is taken from a lecture delivered by Mr. John F. McManus early in 1971. The first half of this program is an analysis of political and economic systems containing basic truths which will never be out of date. The second half discusses the conspiratorial forces at work in our world. We ask you to remember that many of the examples and illustrations were current at the time this lecture was recorded, although subsequent events may make some of them seem dated. In time, of course, this same information will serve as important history rather than a discussion of current events.
As we start this program this evening, I'd like to begin by thanking you all for giving your time and attention to what we have to say. I'm aware of the fact that there are very few Americans who aren't very busy today, and so your willingness to devote some of your time to listen to what I have to say is very appreciated. This entire presentation carries a title, An Overview of Our World. What we propose to do is to supply you with a fundamental premise which we think will help you to understand many of the confusing events of the day. We've all heard the expression about the fellow who couldn't see the forest for the trees. He focused his attention so much on one or two of the trees that he couldn't appreciate the fact that he was in a beautiful forest. And we have countless thousands of Americans today who find themselves focusing all their attention on one significant problem. And there are certainly many problems. And much the same as the individual who couldn't see the forest for the trees, we have a number of people across our nation and around the world today who can't appreciate the fact that the problems that they see are really part of a much bigger problem. What we propose to do this evening, then, is to give you the context in which these problems lie, and we call it an overview. It's our belief that the overview will help you to understand much, if not all, of what is happening in our country. One very important thing to do in an analysis such as this is to give some definitions right at the beginning. We start off with a definition of what we are for, which is simply Americanism. In order to determine what Americanism means, we go right back to the foundation of this nation, to the Declaration of Independence. When our founding fathers decided they'd had enough of British oppression, they wrote the Declaration and set us apart as a new nation. In the Declaration, a small part of it says, we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Right here is the core of Americanism. This small sentence says two very important things. First of all, it says that there is a God, and secondly, that the rights of personal freedoms and private property and freedom of movement, these rights come from no place else but from God, and consequently, no government can take them away. Stop for a minute and reflect on this. Freedoms come from God, not government. You know, a recognition like this at the start of a nation never happened before. No nation ever began with the beginning that we have, and it's because of the truths expressed so well in the Declaration of Independence that our founding fathers went on to build a system of limited government, recognizing that individuals are more important and that the government is the servant, not the master. If we look back over history, we'll see that freedom is an uncommon commodity. In fact, most of the people who have walked the earth have lived a life amounting to slavery. In those isolated instances where freedom did exist, and no one has ever been as free as a citizen in this country, those freedoms were granted by a king, by a ruler, or some governing body, such as the Roman Senate. In every case, these people who did enjoy some amount of freedom found out, history is very clear on this, that if a government can give you freedom, that government can take it away, and it will. This can't happen in our country if we understand and preserve the wisdom expounded by our own founding fathers. They said that rights come from God and that governments are formed primarily to protect those rights. But how few Americans know their own heritage. I've spoken in schools quite frequently, in high schools and in junior high schools, in colleges and even junior colleges. When I do, I usually begin by asking the students a simple question. My question is, where do you get your right to own property? And so a hand will shoot up over here, and a young fellow will jump up and he'll say, government. Well, I wince a little bit inside and say, no, that's not correct. Somebody else try? And another hand will go up, and the second student will get up and he'll say, the Constitution? And I have to say, no, the Constitution guarantees your right. Where do you get it? Do you know I went through 2,000 students before I finally found a young ninth grader who jumped right up and said, God? Finally, I found someone who understood his own heritage. Well, wherever I've been, I've had to remind students and teachers and anyone who'll listen that if you believe a government gave you your rights, then you'll not complain too long or too loud should a government take them away. You are, in fact, being set up for a dictator. Ask yourself now, what might your own answer have been to the question, where do you get your right to own property? If your answer is anything other than God, you should then ask yourself, how come this very fundamental concept is not right at your fingertips? And so Americanism does have a definition. It starts off with belief in God, who is the source of unalienable rights. It proceeds to limitation of government as the essence of freedom, and to freely accepted moral restraints as the guide for individuals. An important point to consider today is this. Can this appreciation of Americanism be taught in the public school? And I'm afraid the answer is no. Because of decisions of the Supreme Court, the teaching of God's existence is no longer possible. Any teacher who positively affirms God's existence can be reprimanded, disciplined, or not invited back. A teacher may present the concept of God as a possibility, but he must also present the other side. How can you teach Americanism without teaching about God? The simple answer is that you can't. Perhaps the real significance of the Supreme Court's decisions is now obvious. The American people have forgotten their own heritage. And if we allow the principles of our nation to fade out of existence, they may never return again. It took close to 6,000 years of recorded history for the truths embodied in the Declaration of Independence to be incorporated as the foundation of a nation. We who have enjoyed more freedom than any man who has ever walked this earth owe it to ourselves to preserve, to protect, and to strengthen Americanism. We also owe it to our children and to generations yet unborn. This then is Americanism, what we are for. We're going now to examine some political systems and give some more definitions. Let's make another important point, however, right at the beginning. We're about to dwell on the different forms of government, and this is certainly important. But when discussing individual freedom, the most important feature of government is not the form, but the amount. We all know what totalitarianism means. It means total government power and slavery for individuals. The feature of totalitarianism that makes it deadly is that the government has total power and the individual has none. No matter what form it may take, total government is destructive of freedom. What this really boils down to is that there's only so much freedom or power available. If the government has all of it, the people have none and are slaves. If the government is limited and has little power, then freedom resides with the individuals. And so, as important as the form of government can be, the most important feature of government, vis-a-vis individual freedom, is the amount. Now let's proceed to analyze the forms of government. I have 5 listed here, and I think all possible systems are represented. And these are monarchy or dictatorship, ruled by one; oligarchy, ruled by a few, an elite; democracy, ruled by majority; republic, ruled by law; and anarchy, ruled by no one. Let's proceed now to discuss the different forms of government to see if we can't narrow it down to fewer than the 5. We start off by crossing out monarchy, dictatorship, simple rule by one, because it rarely, if ever, exists. Every king has his council of nobles or his earls. Every dictator has the heads of his bureaus. And what these governments always result in is not rule by one, but rule by a few. And quite frequently they select one of their number and they put him up front and they ask him to be the public relations man. And so simple rule by one doesn't really exist. We know that this is true because in 1964 we woke up one day and found out that Khrushchev had been fired. Somebody fired him. They put Kosygin and Brezhnev in charge, and they'll rule until that group someday decides to have someone else. And so we cross off monarchy, dictatorship, and we move on to oligarchy, ruled by a few, an elite. And we state very clearly that this is a very common form of government. It's not only the most common form of government today, but it's the most common form of government in all history. What it means is rule by man, where man has seized control and rules with unlimited power. Let's shift now down to the other side here, and we'll talk about anarchy for a few minutes. The prefix A or ANA means without. Anarchy, therefore, means without government. You know, there are some people who really believe that no government is a good idea. These are what we'd call philosophical anarchists, I guess. I think they're foolish, even though we certainly do agree that government sometimes can be very, very evil. Philosophical anarchists overlook a very important feature of human nature, and that is that there are such things as robbers and killers and plunderers. It's precisely because there are criminals that we have chosen to hire a police force to protect ourselves. We could either do it ourselves, or we can pool our resources and ask somebody to do it for us. This is what we have done, and this is government. In fact, this is really all that we ask of government: protection of life and property. This amount of government makes us freer, more mobile citizens, doesn't it? Carry this whole thought a little bit further, and you arrive at the same conclusion that the Greeks did, even in the time before Christ. The Greeks said, without law, there can be no freedom. That seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? Without law, there can be no freedom? Well, what they meant was this, that if every one of us had to stand at our own front door with a shotgun or a baseball bat or something to protect our own life, our own property, and that of our family, then we would be restricted in our movements. We wouldn't be able to go out to go to work. We wouldn't be able to go into the fields. And so because we have somebody else looking after this very important feature of society, then we are more free. Therefore, those who sincerely advocate anarchy are, in reality, defeating their whole purpose. This is a good place to emphasize what we believe to be the proper function of government, which is the protection of life and property. Government should therefore be essentially a negative thing, not a positive thing. Government should not do things for you as much as it should prevent you or others from doing things to someone else. The government that's positive and does things for you has to take first from somebody else in order to do something for you. And of course, if it can take some of what you have, it can take all of what you have. And so we say, therefore, that government should be essentially a negative thing. We also say that anarchy is foolishness as a form of government. But, and this is a very important but, anarchy is advocated by some people not because they want no government, but because they don't like what they have. Anarchy can be important as a means of change. If an individual doesn't like the form of government under which he lives, he can advocate anarchy so that when he has no government, he can then insert what he really would like to have in its place. Have there ever been any anarchists in our country? Well, how about a man who says, if you don't like a law, break it? Disservice to one law is disservice to all, and this is essentially anarchy. How about an individual who says that this body of law is for black men, not white men, or this body of law is for white men, not black men? This, again, is essentially anarchy. And of course, I speak about groups like the SDS and the KKK and others. I think you know what I mean. Has there ever been anarchy in the United States? Yes, there has. We go back to Watts in California in 1965, to Detroit and to Newark in 1967. And we begin to remember, yeah, there was quite a bit of anarchy in the United States. This was a situation where the government had broken down. There was no government, in fact. There was rioting, there was looting, there was chaos, killing, burning, and it was a horrible situation. Now let me ask you a simple question. What might have happened had the situation that prevailed in Detroit and Watts and Newark existed in 200 different cities in this country at the same time? What do you think would have happened? Well, let me suggest to you that good people, just like yourselves, would have gone to the person best able to put an end to the anarchy and begged him to restore order. Now, who's best able to put an end to the situation I've described? The simple answer is the man who started it. And you know, history has shown us time and time again that good people, such as yourselves, will, in time of terrible chaos, go to the criminal savages and the brutes who have brought on the problem and beg them to please take over. And they do. And then what kind of government do you think you get? You get oligarchy ruled by man, where man has unlimited power. Anarchy is a frightful thing. Americans have often wondered how Asian and South American governments can be toppled or greatly influenced because of student rioting or general strikes. I guess that the citizens in Detroit and Watts and Newark could probably answer that question for us today. If you find yourself, as they did, in a situation where you fear for your life, where you stand behind your own front door with a gun or a baseball bat to protect your family, where you can't go to work to earn a living, and where you can't even go to the corner store, either for fear of being shot or because looters have cleaned the place out, you obviously can't exist in a situation like that for very long. The chaos is overwhelming. And so you or a group will, after just a matter of a few days, go to the person best able to put an end to that anarchy and ask him to do something. Please, take over. And he will. The American people have already shown the effects of isolated anarchy in the cry for law and order. But isn't there 100% law and order in the Soviet Union? What they have is unlimited law and order, but there's no justice. And we don't want unlimited law and order in America. We want limited government with justice. And therefore, let's conclude that anarchy is not a stable form of government either. It can be used as a transition from what you have to what someone else wants. It's dangerous, and it needs to be understood. Well, this brings us to a discussion of republics and democracies. We're going to spend a little more time discussing these because we believe there's so much confusion on these two forms of government. Let's begin by stating that most of the people in the United States think that we're a democracy and that we've never been anything else but. And yet, if we pledge allegiance to the flag, we pledge allegiance to the republic for which it stands. Is there a difference between republic and democracy, or is the John Birch Society just playing with semantics, as some have accused? Or is our system a democratic republic, or a republican democracy? Well, let's begin our analysis of these two forms by checking the etymology of the words. We begin by looking at democracy. It comes from two Greek words, demos and kratein. Demos, people. Kratein, to rule. And it means the people to rule, and of course that has always meant that when more people want something than don't, it's majority rules, and so democracy has come to mean majority rule. Now, I know that majority rule has a nice ring to it. It sounds fine. A lot of people nod their head when they hear majority rule. But let me suggest to you that majority rule usually leads to mob rule, which becomes anarchy, and anarchy is followed by tyranny. And so there's something about democracy that I think we ought to examine. Now, I'm going to prevail upon your goodwill here for a few minutes and ask you if we can conduct our affairs for the next few minutes in a democratic way. Let's establish a democracy and see what happens. That means, of course, that majority rules. Now, immediately there's a fellow here in the audience who throws up his hand and proposes that we shave the heads of all the women. What are we going to do? Well, we have to consider his proposal. What we do is we ask him to come up forward and speak in favor of his proposal, and then somebody else comes up here and speaks opposed to it. Well, he comes up, and he's a very clever and witty individual. He's spoken before a lot of groups. Very clever. And he begins right away to convince everybody that this would be a fun thing to do. And then we ask a woman to come up, and she speaks opposed to it, but she's never spoken before a group before. She stutters and she stammers, and she doesn't really do a very good job. You know what these people really are demagogues. That's what that word means. It means the leaders of the people. Well, after we've listened to the demagogues, now we have to count the hands. And so we ask everybody who's in favor of shaving the heads of the women to please raise their hand. We count the votes. Everybody opposed, please raise your hand. We count those votes, and lo and behold, what we have just decided that we're going to shave the heads of the women. And remember, majority rules. So what do? We proceed to shave the heads of the women. Now, I did this one night before a group, and I went right up to the front row, and I said to a lady sitting there right in front of me with a beautiful head of hair, I said, well, here I am. I'm ready to shave your head. Are you ready? You know what she did? She pulled off her wig and handed it to me. Now, if I did that to a particular person, a lady sitting right here in the front row, what is her reaction liable to be? She's probably going to say to me, "You can't shave my head. I've got my rights." And she'd be absolutely correct. She might even go so far as to say, "I've got my constitutional rights," and she'd be even more correct. And do you know what she's describing is not a democracy at all? What she's describing is a republic. What then is a republic? Republic comes from two Latin words this time. It comes from res, thing, publica, public. The public thing, the law. And a true republic is one that has a law that recognizes the rights of individuals, and therefore the limitation in the law is not upon individuals, but upon the government. Let's put this whole thing in perspective in another example. We'll discuss what is commonly known as a lynch mob. I think you all know what a lynch mob is. We'll talk about it first in a democracy and then in a republic. First of all, lynch mob in a democracy. Here we have 35 horseback riders chasing one lone gunman. They catch him. They have a vote. Does he or does he not swing on the end of a rope? Well, the votes are counted. It's 35-1. He loses. And so he swings on the end of the rope. Let's talk now about the same lynch mob in a republic. We have 35 horseback riders chasing that same lone gunman, and they catch him. They vote 35-1 to hang him, and all of a sudden the sheriff rides up. The sheriff said, "You can't hang him. He's got his right to a fair trial." And so they take him back downtown. They select a jury of his peers. They hear the evidence, they hear the defense, and then they decide whether or not he hangs. Does the jury even decide majority rule? No. It has to be unanimous, or he still doesn't swing on the end of that rope. Well, where would you rather live, in a republic or a democracy? It becomes pretty obvious, doesn't it? You want limitation put upon mobs and majorities and governments. And so therefore you want a republic. This is what it's all about. Democracy, on the other hand, has long been recognized by honest historians as an invitation to mobocracy and then to tyranny. And yet, as I stated previously, most of the people in our country think that we are a democracy and that we've never been anything else but a democracy. Democracy did exist in the Greek city-states in the time before Christ. A wise man named Solon had counseled against the unbridled majority rule. Solon's laws were, in fact, the basis for a real republic. But the Greeks were never able to implement these wise principles. They never set up the form of a republic. Democracy ran wild in Greece as successive tyrants swayed the mobs with clever oratory and collectivist promises. In 454 B.C., the Romans adopted the laws of Solon and greatly improved upon the republic that they already had. True to the nature of a real republic, the Roman law limited the government, not the people. They had a system of checks and balances. They had diffusion of powers. They had real protection for the people from the folly of majority rule. In other words, the Roman people were free, and Rome became a very nice place to live. When men are free, they work harder, and they produce more. They do so because they're able to keep the fruits of their labor. They can keep it, they can trade it, they can sell it, they can give it away, and they can pass it on to their descendants. You know, the wealth of a nation isn't money. Wealth is productivity. When more people produce more goods, the wealth of the nation goes up. There's more to go around, and the standard of living goes up, the personal income goes up. As a result, Rome became a very nice place to live. It wasn't too long, however, before the Romans forgot their own heritage. They forgot what freedom was. If you remember nothing else I say in this whole presentation, please remember this. The essence of freedom is the limitation of government. The Romans forgot it. They knew that they were well off, and they began to look to government to protect their wonderful status. They made a fundamental mistake. It doesn't take too long for ambitious politicians to recognize that some people are ready to trade freedom for security. Soon, the politicians in Rome were exceeding the specific powers they were given in the Constitution. They were increasing their own power as they introduced socialistic programs. They began to appeal to mobs, and in reality, they converted the Roman Republic into democracy. If you remember anything at all about Roman history, I'll bet you remember that there were mobs who roamed the streets, demanding more bread and more circuses. As freedom was traded for security and government began to provide it, fewer people were producers, and more people began to live on the dole. Many had been convinced that the government actually owed them their bread and their entertainment. When productivity declined, there was less to go around, and some people went hungry. And then the mobs took to the streets to shake their fist at the system. But they were wrong, weren't they? Their problem wasn't with the system, it was with the perversion of the system. What they really should have sought was a return to the real system, the Republic. In time, the Roman Republic ceased to be, and in time, freedom died with it. It wasn't too long until a period known as the Dark Ages was ushered in, where freedom was almost totally unheard of. Well, how about our own nation? When our founding fathers broke away, they had a clean slate to write on. They could have set up any kind of system they wanted. They wisely looked back over history, and they gave us a republic. In fact, Benjamin Franklin was met outside the Constitutional Convention by a woman who said, "Sir, what have you given us?" And he said, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." There's a great deal of wisdom in that statement. When our founding fathers wrote the Declaration of Independence, they were in fact an oligarchy. They could have done whatever they pleased. In fact, some people came to George Washington and asked him to be a king. But George Washington and others did something fairly unique in history. They divested themselves of the power that they had, and they recommended a republic, limitation of government. And that's what we have. During the Constitutional Convention, great care was taken to specifically limit government. These men knew their history. They knew that the essence of freedom is the limitation of government. And so that's what they gave us. They built into it diffusion of powers, checks and balances. They wisely made sure that no government bureau could become so large that it would become oppressive. Even though they'd done their work well, there were some people at the convention who were still not satisfied. George Mason of Virginia, for example, refused to sign it, and it was largely through his efforts that the Bill of Rights was added, and that's the first 10 amendments. The Bill of Rights is nothing more than further guarantee of the limitation of government. It says the government can't do this, the government can't do this, and this, and this, and this. And the 10th Amendment says, if we forgot anything, you can't do that either. That's right. The first 10 amendments say, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. Congress can't abridge freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, and so on. All the way up to the 10th Amendment that says those powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states and to the people. That's pretty clear, isn't it? It amounted to freedom. Another important feature of the beginning of our republic was that it was not imposed upon us. After promulgating the Constitution, the federal government asked the states to ratify it. In order to explain the Constitution to the people of New York, Hamilton and Madison and Jay wrote letters to the editor of a paper in the New York State. The letters have been collected and are known as the Federalist Papers. Eventually, New York and all the other states ratified the Constitution, and our republic began. Did you know that you can't find the word democracy in the Declaration of Independence? You can't find that word in the Constitution. And you can't find that word in the constitutions of any of the 50 states of this federal union of states. It just isn't there. You will find the word in the Federalist Papers. And there you'll find that our founding fathers greatly feared democracy. In one of the essays that is the Federalist Papers, James Madison said this: "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their death." And so, this is a republic, not a democracy. Let's keep it that way. That's a slogan of the John Birch Society. It's not just semantics. The concepts involved here were once very clearly understood by the people in this nation. They certainly are not today. In 1916, President Wilson sent us into war with the slogan, "To make the world safe for democracy." There were many Americans then who knew that we were a republic and who opposed this drive toward democracy. But unfortunately, there weren't enough. And ever so gradually, the understanding of these differences became further and further destroyed as we begin to slide more and more to majority rule and the tyranny which follows. Let's now make another conclusion. It is that democracy itself is not a stable form of government, but only a transition from the limited rule of a republic to the unlimited rule of an oligarchy. You may for a time live in democracy, but not for long. Democracy must lead to mobocracy and thence to tyranny. It can't go any other way. This leaves us just two ultimate forms of government: a republic with a rule of law, where the law essentially limits the government, or an oligarchy with a rule by man, where man has unlimited power. We've all heard the phrase, a government of laws or a government of man. This is what we're talking about. How has it happened that these fundamental ideas have been lost by our people? There are those who would insist that the present confusion is the result of evolution or chance. My own assessment is that there's a coordinated program to blot out the differences between republics and democracies in order to destroy the limitations built up into a republic. In other words, some people in influential positions want to make us a democracy which will lead to unlimited rule by them. As evidence of my belief that the whole drive is deliberate, let me share with you the definition of democracy given in the official U.S. Army training manual in 1928. This was a book used to train the troops in peacetime. It gave definitions of the various governmental systems, and it did a good job. What it said about democracy was absolutely correct. And so let me read this to you. Let me show you what our own government said about democracy in 1928. Democracy, a government of the masses, authority derived through mass meeting or any form of direct expression, results in mobocracy. Attitude toward property is communistic, negating property rights. Attitude towards the law is that the will of the majority shall regulate, whether it be based on deliberation or governed by passion, prejudice, and impulse, without restraint or regard to consequences. Results in demagogism, license, agitation, discontent, and anarchy. This is right on target. This is what our government said in 1928. Could you believe that an official government publication of the United States would say that the attitude of democracy toward property is communistic? Obviously, this very sound definition had to go, and it did. By 1952, the Army was using the Soldier's Guide, a Department of the Army field manual. And they had a new definition of democracy. It's just about as fundamental a change in the idea as you could possibly find. In 1952, here's what the Soldier's Guide had to say about democracy. Meaning of democracy. Because the United States is a democracy, the majority of our people decide how our government will be organized and run. This is exactly opposite to the thoughts expressed previously. It is, however, the prevailing opinion in this country, and it's leading us into tyranny. How easy it is to get the American people to go along with some proposal if they can be convinced that the majority wants it. And how willingly do we accept the decisions of the Supreme Court as the law of the land, whether they're unanimous or even 5-4 decisions. A Supreme Court decision isn't supposed to be the law of the land. It's the law of the case. The Constitution says that laws are to be made by Congress, and that's the legislative branch of government. The Supreme Court deserves a great deal of the blame for converting our republic into an unbridled mobocratic democracy. Those justices have taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution. And what they have done instead is that they have circumvented and abrogated and overruled and ignored the Constitution for years. Since 1954, the Supreme Court has destroyed the balance of power between the states and the federal government. It has destroyed all of our laws protecting us against internal subversion. It has made practically impossible the job of law enforcement agencies who are supposed to protect us from criminals. In many ways, the men who sit on the Supreme Court violate their oath of office, and they are one of the chief instruments in converting our free republic into a mobocratic democracy. The inevitable result is tyranny, ruled by man. I believe that this whole discussion is high school level material. It could be and it should be understood at that level, but it certainly isn't. In many of the schools I've visited, they teach a course called problems of democracy, and they ignore the biggest problem of all, that it leads to tyranny. You know, an interesting sidelight to this subject is to note how the enemies of Robert Welch have made him seem like a reckless fanatic. Because the American people generally do believe that we are a democracy, if you can quote somebody as saying something bad about democracy, you can make him look very bad indeed. Robert Welch has said that democracy is a fraud. But he also said that we are a republic, and he went on to explain the difference between a republic and a democracy. But our enemies have only chosen one half of that statement, and they've made Robert Welch seem to be a reckless fanatic to many people. We have two illustrations of this right here. One of them appeared in 1961 in Look magazine. And we have another one right here in 1970. And of course, there are many, many illustrations of this same point all along. Did Robert Welch really say that democracy is a fraud? Of course he did. But he explained that we are a republic in a long and valuable speech. To quote only half of what he said is to promote a half-truth, which is essentially a lie. The intention was to deceive people into believing that Robert Welch is trying to destroy the government of the United States. Just the opposite is true. One final word about republic. Is the People's Republic of Red China a real republic? No. No, not at all. There's no limitation, no checks and balances. If the law really rules, the law is anything that Mao says goes. It's unlimited power in the hands of a man. And the same can be said of the Democratic Republic of East Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They aren't republics at all. Their name is simply more communist deceit. Let's move on to some economic considerations now. Most people believe that there's a great struggle going on in the world between communism and capitalism. Well, I certainly agree that there's a great struggle going on in the world, but I no longer believe that the adversaries are communists and capitalists. Let me begin to explain what I'm driving at here by another definition. My definition of capital. And my definition of capital is simply the means of production. It can be expanded to include that which enables you to acquire the means of production. But basically, capital is the means of production. To give a better idea of what this entails, let's consider a primitive economic being. A shipwrecked sailor just washed up on the shore of a small island. He has no food, no clothing. He's in trouble. He searches the island and he finds no food, no berries, no coconuts. He's in deep trouble. So he goes back into the water and he tries to catch fish with his bare hand. He's not able to do it. You and I both know that that's not easy to do. And so then he goes back up on shore. He finds himself a bush. He gnaws off a piece of the bush with his teeth. He makes himself a little spear. Now he goes back into the water, and now he's able to catch fish with his spear. What is his spear? His spear is capital. It's the means of production of fish for him. He gave up some of his time and some of his very precious energy to produce something that he couldn't eat, but something that would help him to produce something that he could eat. Well, with this definition of capital, then, how about a hammer? Isn't that capital? Certainly. How about a machine? How about your automobile? If all of these things are capital, well, then how about the communists in Russia, in China, in Cuba, or anywhere? Don't they use tools, machinery? Don't they use capital? They certainly do. And therefore, aren't they capitalists? They certainly are. Well, then, what's the difference between what they are and what we're supposed to be? The difference is between two kinds of capitalism. And that difference is best expressed with the words monopolistic capitalism and competitive capitalism. And it's between these two types of capitalism that the war rages, as we shall see. The essential difference between a monopolistic and a competitive capitalistic system is where the ownership and the control of the capital really lie. You know, ownership has many more features than simply holding title. I like to tell people I own my own home, and I certainly don't, and probably many of you are in that same boat. When we use the word ownership, we usually mean what I would call simple ownership, holding title to something. But complete ownership includes not only holding title, but also control, use, and the ability to dispose of what you think you own. In fact, that final consideration, the ability to dispose of what you think you own, is the ultimate test of ownership. You should be able to keep it, to sell it, to trade it, to give it away, to do whatever you wanted with it as long as you don't infringe on the rights of others. If someone tells you that you can't sell your home to him and you must sell it to him at that price, then you really don't own it in the complete sense. If you're unable to give your own son as an inheritance the fruits of your labor, then your ownership of those fruits is certainly incomplete. Now, control and use are also essential ingredients of ownership. If you don't control the use of your property, then simply holding title to it can be a burden. In fact, control is more important and far more beneficial than simple ownership. Let me explain what I mean here by telling you about my younger brother. I was in the Marine Corps for many years. During one part of my time in service, they sent me overseas. Now, I had an automobile, and it was mine. I owned it outright this time, completely. For 6 months, I was to be overseas, so for 6 months, I let my brother have my automobile. I owned it. I'd paid for it. I bought the tires, and I'd even filled the tank of gas before I left. But for 6 months, he controlled its use. Who was better off? The man who owned it or the man who controlled it? Or how about the man who has a son in college? For 2 weeks at Christmas time, the boy comes home from school. And for 2 weeks, the family car is not even seen by its owner. Dad paid for it. Dad even worries about it. But for 2 weeks, the son, who hasn't put up a nickel, controls the car. Well, who's better off? Obviously, the man who controls. In fact, simple ownership can be a burden. Getting back now to the two types of capitalism, let's analyze them in light of a more complete understanding of the importance of control over capital. In the monopolistic system, the capital is owned, and by that I mean somebody holds title to it, either privately or by the state. But it is controlled by a select few who are either the state or who control the state. In the competitive system, the capital is both owned and controlled privately. In other words, there are thousands of businessmen, large and small, who own their own little businesses and who do what they want with their own capital. Their only restriction is that they are not permitted to violate the life or the property of others. In the competitive system, we recognize the inherent right to property. In fact, the competitive system is a direct result of the existence of private property. The monopolistic system is a denial of the right of individuals to hold private property. There's no more basic difference between the two systems than this. Why do you think, for instance, that the communists have as a very cardinal principle of their whole program the destruction and the abolition of private property? It's because they're interested in monopolism. What kind of prices will a monopolistic system offer? In the monopolistic system, you'll find the producer will give you a high price because he's got no competition. Your only choice is not to buy. Also, a monopolist won't work very hard to put good quality into the product, and so you'll end up with poor quality. This is precisely why communist goods are so shoddy. With no competition, why should they produce other than junk? In the competitive system, the price will be the lowest possible because you've got 15 or 20 different producers vying for your business. And the quality will also be the best possible within the price range that you're willing to pay. And so in a monopolistic system, you get a high price and poor quality. In a competitive system, you get high quality and a low price. Which do you choose? Well, if you're an honest, thrifty, hard-working producer, you certainly choose the competitive system. If you're part of the market, a consumer, you certainly choose the competitive system. But if you're lazy, stupid, or especially a criminal, you prefer the monopolistic system run by you. Isn't it a fact that criminals always seek to destroy their competition? Well, if a man starts a business and soon he finds himself with a competitor producing a similar product, he has a number of choices open to him if he wants to maintain a monopoly. How do you destroy competition? There are a number of ways of doing it. One way is to kill your competition. Another way is to hire a goon squad to go down there and bust up the competition's factory. or because the government has given favorable legislation to labor unions and actually given them a monopoly over labor. You might be able to have the union call a strike over this man's labor force or his source of raw materials or his distribution system. You might be able to deny him the capability to produce in competition. There are other ways as well. We know that illegal and immoral pressure can be put on some individuals to force them to sell their own business. These methods of maintaining criminal monopoly can't be accomplished without the government being a party to it. If the proper function of government really is to protect life and property, then the goon squad and its originator should be apprehended and punished. If the government winks at all of this, looks the other way, monopoly is guaranteed. If the government sets up artificial controls in the hands of some corporations or some labor unions, then it is inviting monopoly at the expense of freedom. Generally speaking, monopoly can't exist without government being behind it. There are exceptions, very few in fact. A moral and legal monopoly would be one where an individual has produced a product that is so sophisticated and so wonderful that nobody else can figure out how to make it. Of course, that individual's monopoly will only exist for as long as it takes somebody else to figure out how to make his product. The point that I want to make and stress, however, is that government is behind monopolies. It has to be. Many people have asked me over the years why those who seemingly have benefited so greatly from the free enterprise system have no interest in fighting communism. They have no interest in protecting and preserving the competitive system. The people that I'm referring to, of course, are the giant corporation heads like Rockefeller in the oil and banking industry. It would certainly seem that these people have the most to lose if communism should become victorious. And yet, you never hear them opposing communism. Why? The reason why these people don't fight communism is that they are the same thing. They don't fight for a competitive free enterprise system because they are monopolists. And monopolists don't fight other monopolists. Monopolists fight the advocates of competitive free enterprise. They don't want competition. They want a drive for power and wealth, all at the expense of freedom. And this is precisely what the communists seek. We who still believe in the American dream are not capitalists as much as we are the advocates of competitive free enterprise. You know, we've allowed the term capitalist to be hung around our necks like a millstone. That term confuses the issue. It was probably meant to do so. You go onto a college campus today and you find a young fellow walking around that campus who claims to be patriotic. He still loves this country. Unfortunately, in many campuses, he'd be a rarity. But what happens to that young fellow? He'll be beset upon by the radicals. They'll grab him, they'll back him up against the wall, and they'll say, "Oh, you're a capitalist. Well, then go ahead. You defend the robber barons of the 1800s. You defend the child labor abuses and the giant conglomerates that are squeezing all the little people out of business. Go ahead, you're a capitalist." And what does that poor young student do? Well, actually, he's putty in their hands. He can't defend the obvious wrongs because they're indefensible. All he need do is to tell his adversaries that he's not a capitalist as much as he's an advocate of competitive free enterprise, an opponent of monopolies and the excesses that monopolies will bring. If he could only make that simple distinction, he'd be on the offense, and he'd probably gain an ally. Instead, because these simple concepts have been denied him, he retreats, he withdraws, probably he even joins the revolutionaries. There are 4 kinds of state monopolies. They are all alike in that the government controls the capital in every instance. What's different about them is how much of the capital is owned outright by the government. Now, before we analyze these different forms of state monopoly, which are fascism, Nazism, socialism, and communism, let's spend a moment and define the political spectrum. I've been a member of the John Birch Society for a good number of years and a member of the staff since 1966. Now, those of us who are members of the society can recall with me how often we've been referred to as fascists. How often we've been labeled extremists when asked to define what was meant by fascist or what this individual may mean by extremist. Our adversary is unable to give us an answer. But there really is a political spectrum, and all of these terms do have meaning. As far as I can determine, a good way to measure the political spectrum is to go from no government on the extreme right to total government on the extreme left. Now, total government includes any form of totalitarianism, and this would be fascism, Nazism, socialism, and communism. The total right would be anarchy, no government. We've already discussed the fact that the change from anarchy to total government is usually quite speedy. So what it boils down to is that either extreme is bad. If you arrive at a situation where no government prevails, you have a vacuum. Just as nature abhors a vacuum and something will rush in to fill it, when a governmental vacuum exists, something rushes in to fill that. History shows us that totalitarianism is the customary successor to anarchy. Well, what then is the moderate position? How about limited self-government, where the government is limited by constitutional law and the people are limited by freely accepted moral codes, such as the Ten Commandments? You're probably saying that this is precisely what you are for. Well, it's also precisely what the John Birch Society is for. And once again, it's a definition of Americanism. If you're in favor of the Constitution of the United States, you're a moderate, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. If someone insists on labeling you, make them define their terms. Ask them where they put themselves. Most honest political analysts portray the political spectrum as a bar graph from right to left. Because the jump from no government on the extreme right to total government on the extreme left is such an easy jump, I've begun to think that the political spectrum might be best portrayed as a horseshoe, so that the extremes are close together, and the system whose government is limited is furthest from both. But you know, the visual portrayal of this political spectrum isn't nearly as important as the understanding. You can choose your own pictorial representation as long as the definitions are maintained. The types of state monopoly are fascism, Nazism, socialism, and communism. In each, the capital is totally controlled by government. The only difference is how much of it is held in simple ownership. How much of it does the government hold title to? Italy had a fascist government under Mussolini. His whole point of view was to say, what's good for Italy is good for everybody. And so he said, I don't want to own your business. I just want to tell you what to produce and how much to produce and what prices to charge and who to hire and fire and where to buy your raw materials. But I don't want to own you, he said. Well, in effect, he owned everything because he controlled everything. And he was a totalitarian in every sense. Nazism stands for National Socialism. That's left-wing, not right-wing. In Germany, Hitler went one further step. He owned some of the businesses outright, such as the Volkswagen Corporation. He did not own the famous Krupp Iron Works, but he controlled Krupp in the same way that Mussolini controlled the Italian businesses. Hitler, too, was a totalitarian. The socialists don't arbitrarily own this business or that one. They simply own the major industries, such as communications and transportation and the utilities. Through their ownership and control of these vital segments of industry, they control everything else. And this is what exists in England. The socialists are in control no matter which party is in power, and their control is total. Finally, we come to communism, the granddaddy of all in the economic sense. I'm not talking about the communist conspiracy here, only communist economics. This system makes no pretenses anywhere. All the capital is owned outright and controlled outright by the state. No one but the state owns anything in any sense. It's interesting to note here that fascism is far more efficient than communism. And I'm certainly not advocating fascism. Please don't anybody get that idea. Under fascism, a good many people still think that they do own their business because they hold title to it. And as a result, they concern themselves with maintenance and upkeep on machinery, employee relations, and they even paint the building and cut the grass out in front of the place. In a communist system, there's no pretense about any of this. Hence, there's much less chance of anyone showing pride in his work or being deluded. Fascism is more efficient than communism. Have we ever had any fascism in the United States? I can remember back in 1962, an amazing thing happened. Mr. Roger Blau of United States Steel put on a pretty good show for us. I'll tell you why I think it was a good show later in the program here, but for now, let me simply state that I believe the whole business was a charade. What happened in 1962 was that President Kennedy issued guidelines for the steel industry. He said that if you wanted to raise your prices, you could only go this high, and you could not go beyond it. Roger Blau of U.S. Steel announced a price rise above what the guidelines had allowed. Well, the federal officials went after U.S. Steel, and within 24 hours, U.S. Steel brought their price back down. Mr. Blau capitulated very quickly. I was no business analyst then, and I'm still not one today, but I was amazed. How could a thing like that happen in a free enterprise system? Well, shortly after it did, I read an analysis of this whole business in a magazine article. The title of the article was "The Fascist New Frontier." Well, when I saw that title, I said to myself, that's rough stuff. But then I read the article. In it, the terms were defined, and I was forced to agree. It was government control without government outright ownership, and that's fascism. Early in 1970, John Kenneth Galbraith, famous economist, suggested in a speech that wage and price controls were absolutely necessary as a cure for inflation. Inflation is bad, I agree, but the wage and price controls only compound the problem. Without getting too deeply into the subject, inflation is a situation where money is losing value. Dollars won't buy today what they would previously. This condition is especially damaging to older people who live on fixed incomes. But inflation is caused by profligate spending of government. It's also caused by removing the backing from currency. And the way to cure inflation is to get the government to spend within its means and to put some real gold and real silver back behind the currency. Well, the socialists and the monopolists, who are really the cause of inflation due to their damaging policies, now propose as a cure for inflation an increase in power for themselves. This is treating the symptom and not the disease. It's in fact worsening the problem, and I'm sure that they realize it. It's like treating a cold by inducing pneumonia. Shortly after Galbraith told us how necessary wage and price controls are, Mr. Arthur Burns, the head of the Federal Reserve, said the same thing. And then other people began to jump on that bandwagon, some congressmen and then some senators. In the summer of 1970, Congress passed legislation authorizing the president to institute wage and price controls at his discretion. And President Nixon said he didn't want that kind of power as he signed the bill. Wage and price controls would amount to a giant step toward tyranny. We don't have to find ourselves with these controls around our necks, but it's going to take a great deal more awakening of our fellow citizens in order to keep it from happening. Winding up this discussion of economics, let's simply state that everyone who owns property is a capitalist. From the Aborigine with his blowgun, to the American businessman, to the slave master in Moscow. The difference in economic systems, when freedom is the consideration, is who owns the capital. Is it a monopoly system or a free enterprise system? And the important distinction to keep in mind is whether or not individuals can own, control, use, and dispose of property. Freedom and private property go hand in hand and always have. I'd like to again insist that what we've covered in this discussion is high school level or even junior high school level material. It could be and should be understood by young people. Now, it's very basic, I realize that. And there are some areas of economics that would certainly complicate what we've discussed here. But these very basic truths aren't being taught, and it certainly isn't understood by most of the people in our country. Let's now combine the economic and the political systems. Can there be such a thing as a monopolistic republic? No, not really. That makes about as much sense as dry water. A competitive free enterprise system run by an oligarchy is also hard to believe. If it has ever existed, it hasn't for very long. It might well have existed under a benevolent dictator or a kindly king. But a benevolent dictator or a kindly king can be replaced by someone who's not too benevolent or not too kindly. And also we have the problem that power corrupts, and the power possessed by an oligarchy, such as a king or a dictator, will unfortunately lead to monopoly. The most probable combination of the political and economic systems is to have a monopolistic oligarchy or competitive free enterprise republic. As far as I'm concerned, you will live in one or the other. You may for a time live in transition, but these are the stable systems. As to which you choose, I really don't have much doubt. Unless, as was discussed previously, you're a criminal. If you're the ordinary, hard-working, God-fearing type who wants to be left alone, then you want the free enterprise republic. But in order to have it, you're going to have to realize that you've got to work for it. And you've got to get busy now. Freedom isn't free. The confusion and the deception of the American people on these fundamental concepts is not accidental. As we pointed out before, there's evidence to show that the distinction between republics and democracies has been deliberately blurred. The same can be said of the distinction between competitive free enterprise and monopolism. Those who are anxious to destroy our free republic and rule us in a monopolistic oligarchy have been working to achieve it for generations. They've deceived, they've distorted, and they've duped millions of people in their drive for power. Working stealthily from behind scenes, they've reached a position now where success for them is in sight. Well, what I've just described to you is a conspiracy. A conspiracy is a plot to accomplish an evil purpose. I have no doubt that there are individuals who are working together to seize total power. That it is an evil thing is equally certain. I contend it would be evil to destroy freedom. In the second part of this film, we'll discuss the conspiracy. We took all of this time in order to provide you with definitions and to lay a base of understanding. Now we'll discuss names and organizations and methods of operation of this conspiracy. We'll also present the plans and the programs that can defeat it. Recall, if you will, with me, the title of this presentation, An Overview of Our World. The overview is an understanding of the conspiracy. Once an individual accepts this basic premise, the many confusing events of the day fall right into place. If you can begin to see what we mean by this conspiracy, then we certainly hope that you'll stay to view the remainder of the film. At this point in the program, I usually discuss some of the literature that we have available. Many people have come to me and asked me if there are specific pieces of literature that they could read to get a better understanding of the things that we've talked about. And there are. One of the best things that I think anyone can read on these subjects is a short book called The Law, written by a man named Bastiat, who was in fact a Frenchman who lived about 140 years ago. He wrote this book in the 1840s in France. In fact, he was facing the same problems in France that we find ourselves combating today. And his little book of about 65 pages is the best definition of the proper role of government that I think can be found anywhere. It's written in easy-to-read style, could be and should be understood by high school students today. And so we recommend The Law very, very highly. Now, another book that we recommend very highly is the Blue Book of the John Birch Society. When the John Birch Society was founded in 1958, it was founded at a 2-day meeting. Robert Welch spoke to an assembly of 11 men for 2 full days. The transcript of what he said then is now the Blue Book of the John Birch Society. And the Blue Book is simply an analysis of the problems and then a possible solution. Along the way, the author gave his own thoughts in the area of political science and economics, and he gave a very valuable explanation of many important things. The Blue Book contains a course in political science that is far greater than you'll receive if you go to college today in many cases. And so we recommend the Blue Book of the John Birch Society not only because it has so many of these basic truths that we've talked about, but also because it's a concrete plan to follow to overturn a great conspiracy. Now, another book that we recommend is The Politician by Robert Welch. This is probably the most controversial book of the 20th century, if not the whole world. It's the biography of Dwight David Eisenhower. We're aware that many people are very upset about the fact of this book, but most of the people who are upset about it have never read it. If you're like me, you'll read The Politician and you'll get so angry that you'll probably fling the book against the wall. And then you'll go and pick it up again and read some more. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the facts in the book have never been disproven. Only the possible conclusions of the author have been called into question. In fact, the history contained in this book is so important that we say you can't really understand what has happened in this world for the last 30 years without reading The Politician. And so we urge that you do. And keep in mind the author's closing, where he says that if this history is disturbing to both the reader and myself, don't blame him who wrote it, blame him who made it. The final book that I wanted to recommend is called Quest of a Hemisphere. It's a history book. It's written for high school and junior high school students. It has been recently published by Western Islands, which is an affiliate of the John Birch Society. It's what we think is the finest history book published in this country in the 20th century. In fact, anybody who reads that book will learn something good about this country that he never knew before, with very few exceptions, I'm sure. The Quest of a Hemisphere is readable history, and it's important history, because Americanism is such a different thing from any other government system that ever came before. And so if you have a young person in your family, or if you yourself would like to again appreciate the fact of Americanism, we recommend The Quest of a Hemisphere by Donzella Cross Boyle. I always like to tell the story about the conservative anti-communist college professor as we start the second half of this talk. This college professor had taken a position on the faculty of a college where pretty nearly everyone was a socialist. The students and the other professors were socialists, and he was all alone. He began to teach his course, and he found himself in almost complete disagreement with everybody there. His students wouldn't bend, nor would he, and each class was degenerating into a wrangle. One day the professor called a halt to all the arguments, and he said, "I want everybody to write an essay. I'll assign the topic. Everyone work on the same topic, which is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need." Well, the students were elated because this is the classic position of the socialist. According to socialism, everybody works and puts into a common storehouse what he produces, and then only draws out of it what he needs. Well, the students went to do their papers, and when they turned their papers in, one young girl in the class had done a real fine job. She researched the topic, she footnoted it, she documented it, and she typed it up beautifully. The professor took the papers home, read through them all, and gave her C+. When she saw her mark, she was furious. She rushed up and she demanded to know why she had C+. After all, she said, "This is my favorite topic. I did a great deal of work on this paper, and I was sure I'd receive a better grade." The professor smiled and suggested that she calm down for just a minute. Then he explained. He said, "You know that fellow who sits over there by the window? I think he plays football. Well, he really didn't do very well on this paper. In fact, he earned an F. And so what I did was I took some of your credits and gave you both C+. You know, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need." Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm trying to demonstrate is that socialism is completely contrary to man's nature. You can imagine what the result would be in that school or any school if such a marking system were adopted. Before very long, everyone would be doing F-level work. So, too, in any other endeavor, from farming to manufacturing to ditch digging, Socialism cannot work because it is natural for a man to want to keep the fruits of his labor. Well, we talked about a conspiracy that wishes to rule us. This conspiracy, in fact, wishes to rule the whole world. We have a chart now that portrays the method of operation of the conspiracy. It will become more clear as we proceed. Right at the top, we have the elite, the oligarchy of which we spoke. Some want to call this the establishment. Some prefer the military-industrial complex. The John Birch Society uses the term insiders, which is a very good term. Whatever you wish to call it, it's simply a conspiracy to rule the world. The conspirators already have an organization to administer their rule. It's called the United Nations. That's what the UN is, a world government. Even the UN's advocates will agree on that. But isn't it generally agreed that the UN is kind of worthless? Perhaps you've heard, as I have, that the UN is powerless, a meaningless debating forum, an organization that really accomplishes very little. Certainly, most Americans would say, the UN is no threat. Well, I'm sorry, I don't believe that anymore. In fact, I think the UN is a distinct threat. Let me tell you why. The leadership of the United Nations is composed of three chief officials. The first is Mr. U Thant of Burma, who is the Secretary General. U Thant is a self-professed Marxist who is, therefore, philosophically committed to the destruction of free enterprise. We're told that he's a neutral. Some neutral, huh? There are two chief undersecretaries in the UN. The first is Dr. Ralph Bunche of the United States. He was identified as a communist in sworn testimony before official government bodies by two American Negro communists, both of whom had known him in the communist movement many years ago. These two men, Leonard Patterson and Manning Johnson, had both been high officials in the communist apparatus. Each had been trained in Moscow. They both found out that the communists weren't trying to help the American Negro, but instead they were trying to use the American Negro. So Manning Johnson and Leonard Patterson both broke with communism and spent the rest of their time and their energy on Earth fighting the conspiracy. They each knew that Bunche was a communist. The other chief undersecretary is the Undersecretary for Political and Security Council Affairs. This is probably the most strategic position in the United Nations because this office carries jurisdiction for the UN in all military, disarmament, and atomic energy matters. It's a most important post. The man who holds it today is Leonid Kudakov of the Soviet Union. The fact that only communists get to be Undersecretary for Political and Security Council Affairs is not just a coincidence. We learned from Trygve Lie, who was the first permanent Secretary General and a predecessor of U Thant, that this arrangement was secretly agreed upon at the founding of the United Nations, and that agreement has been met ever since. Trygve Lie, in his book, In the Cause of Peace, written actually to praise the UN, said that he could not hide his astonishment at the fact that our country's representatives would agree to such a thing. The post of Undersecretary for Political and Security Council Affairs, again, has jurisdiction in all military affairs, disarmament affairs, and atomic energy matters. In 1961, President John Kennedy introduced the disarmament plan in a speech at the United Nations. The plan is called Freedom from War, the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World. It was put together by our State Department and released as State Department Publication 7277. As you can see from this comment by then Senator Joseph Clark of Pennsylvania, this program is the fixed and determined policy of the government of the United States. It's a three-stage program which will lead to the United States turning over its armed forces to the United Nations. As the document itself says, disarmament would proceed to a point where no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. In other words, the only military force would be the United Nations, and it would be controlled by a communist. When this document was first made public, many Americans tried to obtain a copy. It quickly went out of print, and so the John Birch Society reproduced it photographically and now makes it available to anyone. Today, if you write to Washington about it, you'll be told that State Department document 7277 has been superseded and it's no longer in effect. But it was replaced by a new position statement that says the same thing. The new official position, the blueprint for the peace race, says on page 33, the parties to the treaty would progressively strengthen the United Nations Peace Force until it had sufficient armed forces and armaments so that no state could challenge it. The most obvious question about this disarmament business is are we really implementing these disarmament schemes? And the answer is yes. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is part of it. The treaty banning the use of outer space for nuclear weapons is part of it. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is part of it. You can find these things listed in State Department document 7277. The closing down of our overseas bases, like in Greece and Turkey, part of it. The fact that we have no new weapons systems since Robert McNamara became Secretary of Defense is part of it. The reduction of our armaments levels, even while we're supposedly at war. And the continuation of disarmament discussions going on in Europe right now. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT talks. These are also part of it. In fact, we are at least halfway through this entire program. And people who know far more about this than I do have told me that at the present schedule, the program will be completed in less than 5 years. At that time, we will have successfully turned over our remaining armed forces to our sworn enemies, and history will look upon the American people as the biggest fools that ever lived. Is the UN a threat? Most certainly it is. We shouldn't disarm ourselves. The best way to ensure peace is to be so strong that no one dares to start trouble. We should maintain such military superiority that no one would even consider anything but high respect for our country. We should remain militarily strong, even though the threat posed by this conspiracy is not chiefly a military threat. It's domestic subversion. I've portrayed a parallel structure of the USSR government on one side and our own government on the other side. I want to analyze the structure for each side. As we do so, however, let's recall a simple rule of thumb that will help us to understand what really is going on. It's something my father used to tell me. He said, if you want to know who's really running the show, look at the bottom of the check. Not the middle, but the bottom, the man who pays the bills. So please keep that in mind as we go through this analysis. The Soviet Union is run by an oligarchy called the Politburo. Remember back in 1964? Khrushchev was fired. We discussed that already. Who fired him? The Politburo. The rule in Russia is not an individual as much as it is a group. The USSR began in 1922 when the communists consolidated Russia and Georgia and Azerbaijan and the Ukraine and other small countries into a union. The communists seized control of Russia in 1917, as is widely known. What is not widely known is that the whole business was contrived and brought to fruition by outside help, even the government of the United States. In 1917, however, the czars were overthrown by the democratic socialists led by Kerensky. Before the year was out, the Bolsheviks had overthrown Kerensky and set up a base of operations for communism. The men who accomplished this were Lenin and Trotsky. An interesting thing to know is that their whole operation was financed and assisted by others, supposedly non-communists. Early in 1917, Lenin was in Switzerland. When Kerensky overthrew the czars, Lenin was supplied with a great deal of money and aided in his return to Russia by German military intelligence, supposedly bitterly anti-communist. Lenin's financier was a man named Warburg of the House of Rothschild, the international banking empire, the makers and breakers of governments. When Lenin arrived in Russia, he began to organize and waited for Trotsky. Trotsky was in New York. He was provided $20 million by Jacob Schiff, a relative of Warburg who was an American citizen. Trotsky left New York by ship with a contingent of Bolsheviks from New York. When the ship stopped in Nova Scotia, Canadian authorities came aboard the ship and grabbed Trotsky, and they refused to allow him to proceed. They correctly reasoned that Trotsky would replace Kerensky, take Russia out of World War I, which was then in progress, and free German troops to go to the Western Front and kill Canadians. And so they pulled Trotsky off the ship and held him in the interests of Canadian troops. That's a pretty reasonable point of view. Right at this critical point in history, however, pressure was brought upon the Canadian government to release Trotsky. The pressure originated from President Woodrow Wilson and his chief advisor, Colonel Edward Mandell House. It was sufficient to force the Canadians to back down. Trotsky was freed and did proceed to Russia. He and Lenin did establish a communist base of power with tremendous and vital assistance from outsiders, including the President and the office of the President of the United States. Americans should ask themselves why. In the early 1920s, the communist government in Russia found itself completely unable to feed the people. Economic barbarism, combined with drought, had caused a terrible famine. The communists were in serious trouble and they needed help. The commodity they needed most was food. It's important to remember at this point that no one can deal with a citizen in a totalitarian state. You must deal with the government. When this terrible shortage of food developed, help was provided to the communists by our government. The Food for Peace program supplied nearly $90 million worth of food to Russia. Throughout the duration of this program, the government in Russia used the food to solidify its control over the people. The humanitarian instincts of our people were used in a program which kept communism alive. In 1933, the communist government in Russia was again in deep trouble. They were considered to be a barbaric regime by many nations of the world. They were out of friends, out of credit, and actually staying alive at the time by what is known as check-kiting. When he became president in 1933, one of the very first acts of his presidency, Franklin Delano Roosevelt officially recognized the Soviet Union. This immediately added prestige, legitimacy, and respect for the communists who were actually and literally saved from financial collapse by FDR's act. In the 1940s, we actually built the Soviet Union into a world power with $12 billion worth of lend-lease. Huge quantities of everything imaginable were shipped to the communists. Most of the goods shipped were not direct military hardware, but even that portion of it that was military hardware was not used against Germany or Japan in World War II, but was used against General MacArthur in Korea. And of course, not 1 cent has ever been paid on what has been correctly called the greatest mail-order catalog in history. If you'll stop for a minute to assess World War II, you'll probably be forced to agree with me that the only lasting effect of the war was the emergence of the Soviet Union as a world power. Germany and Japan, our adversaries, very quickly became strong allies. But because of our help, the Soviet Union became the world power that it presently is. Ever since World War II, we have continued to finance their failures and bail them out of their difficulties. We've given them wheat when they were hungry. We've given them petroleum. We've set up industries for them. To both Russia and all the communist satellites in Europe, we have given jet planes, airborne communications equipment, radar, navigation instruments, complete chemical plants, tire cord factories, machine tools, computers, everything imaginable, even money, foreign aid. The variety and the extensiveness of the aid is so great that I'm convinced that a cessation of it would mean an end to communism. A great deal of the material sent to the communist bloc is from American businessmen. These men receive their payment from communist governments who have in many instances obtained the money on loan. This bank is taxpayers' money from the United States set up into a pool from which foreign governments can borrow, such as the communist government. After borrowing our money, the communists are frequently the recipients of foreign aid from our government, or in occasional grandiose gestures of so-called magnanimity and bridge building, we cancel their debts. The horrible fact of the matter is that communism has been kept alive and promoted into prominence right from the beginning by others, and by far the largest single financier of communism has been the government of the United States. During all of this time, the American people have remained opposed to communism, but facts are facts. And again, I would remind you that the bottom of the check is the key to an understanding of what's happening. Let me now suggest to you something that we'll discuss in great detail shortly. And it's that communism is in reality only a tool or a front for a conspiracy that is using it to conquer the world. Let me further suggest that those forces and individuals who have in reality seized the government of the United States are using our government and our wealth to subvert the entire planet. Let's now look at our own government. This time we'll discuss not what it's supposed to be, which we've already done, but what it really is. And what it really is an oligarchy of individuals who have seized control. I have a couple of organizations listed here whose members make up the government of the United States. These people and these organizations wield great power in our nation and constitute what has been dubbed the establishment. These organizations are the ADA, Americans for Democratic Action, the LID, League for Industrial Democracy, and the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. The first two of these, the ADA and the LID, are outgrowths of the Fabian Socialist Society in England. The Fabian Socialist Society in England began in 1884. Its purpose right from the beginning was to permeate and penetrate every stratum of British society, organization, and government in order to make England a socialist nation. Let's be honest about it. They've succeeded. England today is a socialist nation, whether the Labour Party or the so-called Conservative Party is in power. To give an example of the power of the Fabians, at one time shortly after World War II, Fabians held the following positions in England: Prime Minister, 10 cabinet ministers, 35 undersecretaries and other officers of the state, and 229 members of Parliament. The Fabian movement in America was begun in 1905 with the establishment of the ISS, the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. The movement began at colleges like Columbia and Harvard, and Yale and Princeton and Amherst and Barnard and Michigan and Pittsburgh and others. Some of the early founders included Jack London, Upton Sinclair, and a Harvard student named Walter Lippmann. Growth of the ISS was interrupted by World War I when socialism fell into disfavor. In 1921, the ISS changed its name to the League for Industrial Democracy. And then the student branch was reorganized in 1928 under the banner of the Student League for Industrial Democracy, SLID. The LID, through its members, exercised great influence in labor. Men like the Ruthers and David Dubinsky and I.W. Abel and Joseph Carey, prominent labor leaders in the United States, are members of the League for Industrial Democracy. In the academic world, a very famous individual named John Dewey, a member of the League for Industrial Democracy. And even in Congress, we found members of this Fabian socialist organization in America. Senators Paul Douglas, Hubert Humphrey, and Herbert Lehman, and Wayne Morse, and many others. And we find that many other fields also have very important representation from the League for Industrial Democracy. In 1962, the leaders of the Student League for Industrial Democracy changed the name of their group to the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS. And the SDS is, of course, openly promoting Marxism and revolution in our own country. The ADA is the political arm of the Fabian movement. It began in 1947 at a meeting held at the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C. Some of its founders include Hubert Humphrey, the Alsop brothers, and then we find men like Galbraith and Schlesinger and Walter Reuther and others, members of the ADA. In 1961, to give you an idea of how important this organization really is, 36 high officials of John Kennedy's New Frontier were ADA members. It's safe to say today that the ADA controls the Democratic Party, and there are also members of the ADA in the Republican Party as well. The third organization I have listed here is even more important. It's the Council on Foreign Relations. The CFR was organized when the United States Senate declined to have our country join the League of Nations. This was at the close of World War I. The League of Nations was to be what the United Nations is today. It had been constructed and proposed largely by this same Edward Mandell House, Wilson's alter ego, and other internationalists from around the world. When our senators said no to the League of Nations, House and his associates were in Paris. They and their British counterparts formed organizations to promote world government. The British formed the RIIA, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and the Americans formed the Council on Foreign Relations. World government was the goal. World government sounds good to a great many people, but if the United States gets into world government, we'd have to merge with communists and socialists and all sorts of oligarchies. We'd have to forsake unalienable rights that came from a creator because these other countries don't recognize them. The Bill of Rights would have to go. And our 6% of the world's population, who have produced and who therefore own better than half of the world's goods, would be compelled to share what we have. A world government would necessarily be a coalition government with communists. There's never been one of these that the communists didn't control. World government would mean an end to Americanism. What we should do, instead of watering down our principles, is to climb out of the socialist mess we're in and show the rest of the world how they too can produce more and live better through the adoption of limited government and free enterprise. The CFR, right from its incorporation in 1921, has promoted world government. Its founder was Colonel House and his young lieutenants, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, Christian Herder, Walter Lippmann, and Norman Thomas, and many other individuals whose names are far better known to a bygone generation. The CFR began to attract men of power and influence, whom it influenced so that they could have an effect on others. Heavy financing of the CFR began in the late 1920s when the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation and others began to pour money into the organization. The influence of the CFR grew to such an extent that by the 1940s, it was safe to say that with precious few exceptions, everything the American people were permitted to know came to them through the Council on Foreign Relations. Today, their power and influence is immense. Let's go through a few categories of interest in our country to show what we mean. We start off by noting that the leadership of NBC and CBS is CFR. There is CFR leadership at the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Des Moines Register, the Louisville Courier-Journal, the Denver Post, the Minneapolis Tribune, and through their regional committees on foreign relations set up in 34 cities of this country, the leadership of scores of newspapers. In the magazine world, we find CFR leadership at Time, Life, Newsweek, Look, U.S. News and World Report, and others. The academic world is heavy with CFR leadership also, as we find on CFR lists present or recent presidents of Harvard, Dartmouth, Yale, Cornell, Columbia, Princeton, and Notre Dame. In the business world, we find what I call the corporate socialists, the monopolists who don't oppose communism and who don't promote free enterprise. Such CFR members as Roger Blau of U.S. Steel. I told you we'd get back to Roger Blau. I don't consider him to be an advocate of free enterprise at all. We also find the Watsons of IBM and David Rockefeller of the Chase Manhattan Bank in New York, H.J. Heinz of the Food Company, Stanley Marcus of Neiman Marcus Department Stores in Texas, Najib Halaby of Pan American Airlines, and many others. The military is well represented also by the political generals and admirals. Men like Lyman Lemnitzer and Lawrence Norstead and Maxwell Taylor, Lucius Clay, William Westmoreland, and General Andrew Goodpaster, the new head of NATO. In government itself, the leadership of the Kennedy-Johnson administration was thoroughly CFR. Cabinet officers such as Rusk of State, Fowler of Treasury, McNamara of Defense, Gardner of Health, Education, and Welfare, Freeman of Agriculture, all CFR members. John Kennedy himself and Vice President Hubert Humphrey, plus ambassadors and CIA heads and other appointees belong to the CFR, and there are others too numerous for us to list. The Nixon administration promised a change, but the CFR is still running things. Over 100 separate appointments to high positions in government have been given to CFR members by Mr. Nixon. Cabinet officers, ambassadors, the Director of National Security, Dr. Henry Kissinger, and others. The reason why there's been no change in the direction our country's been going is that both political parties are led by CFR members. On the Democrat side, Senators Kennedy and Humphrey and Pell and Symington and McGee and others are CFR members. On the Republican side, the so-called moderates. Nelson Rockefeller, Jacob Javits, Clifford Case, Henry Cabot Lodge, former President Eisenhower was a member, and Richard Nixon himself. Today, Richard Nixon claims that he's not a member of this organization, but he was a member in the early 1960s. And during the campaign in 1968, he had circulated an article he wrote for the CFR magazine, Foreign Affairs, which praised regional government. And this, of course, is a stepping stone on the way to world government. And then Mr. Nixon appointed over 100 CFR members to key positions in government. There's been no change. Democrats or Republicans produce the same dangerous policies. You know, I have a friend who says if there really is a two-party system in this country, then the Republican Democrats is one of them. For a final category of important CFR leadership, let's look at the tax-exempt foundations, whose huge wealth is being used to subvert our way of life. All of the big ones are dominated by CFR leadership on their boards of directors. Foundations such as Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Sloan, 20th Century Fund, and others all have a predominance of CFR leaders. While the CFR is not the conspiracy itself, nor is every CFR member necessarily a knowing, willing destroyer of what we hold dear, the history, purpose, and power of this organization would certainly indicate that it should be carefully watched. And yet, better than 90% of the American people have never even heard of the organization, much less do they appreciate its great significance. Not too long ago, I had opportunity to speak at an Eastern college. Better than 150 students came to hear and to see a real live Bircher. The revolutionaries were out in force with their headdresses and uniforms. Some came to ridicule, but most came to listen. Before I described the CFR, I asked how many in the room had ever heard of this organization. Not one had. And virtually all of them were certain that they had all the information they needed to make important decisions regarding Vietnam, domestic unrest, fiscal problems, and so on. 150 students in one room, and not one of them had ever heard of the CFR. At another college, I had spoken before about 75 students, and I asked the same question. How many have ever heard of an organization called the Council on Foreign Relations? This time, one hand went up. Well, I was impressed. I was curious, so I asked the young man how and where he had heard of this group. His answer very quickly was, "Oh, I heard you speak here last year." Many members of the CFR are also members of the ADA and the LID. There's a good deal of overlapping. These groups and other groups constitute an oligarchy running our country. There are also groups such as the United World Federalists, the Business Advisory Council, the Foreign Policy Association, and others that contribute to the same clique. If you wish to learn more about this whole business, then you should read the contents of the CFR packet, which I'm sure your host can make available to you. Back on the USSR side of this chart, we spoke of the Politburo as the ruling body in the Soviet Union. There's also the Presidium, whose function it is to run communist parties throughout the world, including the Communist Party in the United States of America. Representatives of communist parties throughout the world meet periodically in Moscow to receive their instructions. The Communist Party in North Vietnam was told to start military activity in Southeast Asia. In our country, the executive branch of government told our military to go to war. Those who still remember the Constitution will recall that only Congress, the legislative branch, has the power to declare war. Congress has never declared war, but war it is in Southeast Asia. What kind of a war is it? I can only conclude that it's a phony war. Why do I say this? Well, simply because neither side wants to win. Did you ever stop to realize that? Each succeeding administration in Washington has stated very clearly that victory is not the goal. And the communists are quite content to involve us indefinitely. Another feature of the war that convinces me it's a phony war is that the United States supplies both sides. We've already talked about aid to communists. Let's now realize that our aid to Russia and the European communist nations is what keeps North Vietnam going. You know, there's total agreement on this throughout the world. Everyone agrees that North Vietnam can't keep the war going by herself. And she does so with tremendous help that she receives from her communist allies. The communists agree on it, President Nixon agrees, the John Birch Society agrees, and no one disagrees. But the John Birch Society is virtually the only voice saying we should stop supplying those who supply North Vietnam. Add to all this the conduct of the war itself. Our men must fight with severe restrictions that are hard to believe. They can't shoot until shot at. They can't chase the enemy across borders and into sanctuaries. They're not permitted to destroy strategic targets and really hurt the enemy. North Vietnam is served by only one seaport, Haiphong Harbor. Huge numbers of ships steam in and out of there all the time with material for the Viet Cong. Why hasn't this port been closed? I'm told, and I think it accurate, that Haiphong Harbor was closed for the duration of World War II by sinking a small ship at the mouth of the harbor. And today we go to great pains to keep it open. Why? Americans ought to ask themselves why. To say that the war is unpopular is to state the obvious. Why then has it dragged on for years? The answer is simply that there are those who want it to drag on. To understand why, we have to assess the effects of the war. The first effect, of course, is death in Southeast Asia. Americans are dying, Vietnamese are dying, and the nameless, faceless Viet Cong are dying. However, without trying to minimize the very real fact of death, the major effects of the war are not being felt in Southeast Asia at all. The major effects of this war are being felt right here in our country, and they're all bad. What are they? Bankrupt our currency, destroy our military, increase government power. War means more government always. Also, to destroy anti-communist morale and sentiment, to increase moral decline. The eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die philosophy, especially among the young. But the biggest effect of the war is the division of our people. Our enemies know that divide and conquer works, and they have successfully divided us over real or imagined issues for years. Labor versus management, black versus white, even male versus female now. But a major division today is young versus old. It's serious, and its greatest catalyst is the war in Vietnam. The young people in our nation are constantly being given a portion of the truth about the war. They don't like it, and then they are collected into all kinds of groups set up by the left to gather youthful idealism and energy into a force to shake its fist at the system. Large numbers of young people actively seek to destroy this country without any appreciation of what they are doing or for whom they are laboring. I had an amazing conversation with a college student SDS member once. I asked him very frankly what he was trying to accomplish, and he responded, "I'm trying to destroy the American system." Well, I appreciated his frankness, but then I asked him, "What will you put in its place should you succeed?" He answered, "I don't know. I haven't considered that. I'm too busy." Well, then I asked, "What do you think of the possibility that someone has set you in motion and is fueling your activity because he has something in mind when the system is destroyed?" The answer, again, very frankly, that may well be the case, but I'm not concerned about it. I'm too busy destroying. Reviewing quickly, we see that the effects of the Vietnam War are bankrupt our currency, destroy our military, increase government, destroy the will to resist, accelerate moral decline, and divide our people. All goals of the communist conspiracy. Ladies and gentlemen, the war in Vietnam is, in reality, a war on the American people by the American government. The only beneficiary is the oligarchy of insiders who wish to rule us and rule the world. What then to do about Vietnam? Continuing the never-ending no-win slaughter is abhorrent to all, except the conspiracy. There are then two alternatives: pull out or win. To those who advocate cut and run, I simply remind them that this is exactly what we did in Korea. We didn't win in Korea, and because we didn't, we're in Vietnam today. I'm sure that most would agree that a successful and decisive victory in Korea would have destroyed the potential for the Vietnam War. If we cut and run in Vietnam, we'll see another limited war somewhere else very soon. Those who have precipitated Korea first and then Vietnam will have us in Indonesia, the Philippines, Australia, maybe even Hawaii. To pull out means to repeat the same continued bloodshed soon again. And so, the only remaining alternative is victory. Why not victory? Does this mean dropping a nuclear bomb on every village and hamlet in Vietnam? No, of course not. Dozens of military men have stated that the war could be won in months if only they were allowed to. The first thing that should be done is to stop helping the other side. We talked before about aid and trade to communists that fuels the war for North Vietnam. Let's put an end to it. It is so extensive, in my opinion, that the war could not continue without American help to communists all over the globe. There are those who say that our aid and trade to communists is non-strategic. I maintain that there's no such thing as non-strategic trade. But let me ask you, do you think we should send entire chemical plants, tire cord factories, machine tools, jet engines, petroleum, and ball bearings to the communists? I spoke at a Polish-American club in Fall River, Massachusetts, some years ago. In the course of my talk, I stated that any aid to a communist nation was wrong because it simply strengthened the hand of the government, which is the captor. I stressed that any help, even food, could not get to the people except through the government because it's a totalitarian system. The government would then use even food to control the people. At this point, a man in the audience interrupted me. He said, "I'd like to confirm what this speaker has just said about trade. I've been to Poland 3 times in the past 10 years to visit my relatives. Each time, they have begged me to do what I could to get our government to stop helping theirs." Ladies and gentlemen, the whole story about aid and trade to communists, right from the beginning in 1917, is contained in what we call the aid and trade packet. Please get one. Please read it. The next thing we should do regarding Vietnam is to remove the inhuman restrictions from our men. No man should be sent into battle until and unless that nation that sends him gives him every possible opportunity to win so that he can come back home unharmed as quickly as possible. I realize that the present leaders of our nation do not have victory as their goal. And so what I'm really saying by advocating victory in Southeast Asia is that we need to change the attitude of the present leaders, or we have to change the leaders. If we don't and allow the present attitude to prevail, we shall soon live in tyranny. Returning now to the communist side of the chart, we want to discuss the Communist Party, CPUSA, for a while. Let's start off by stating that the Communist Party is not the communist conspiracy. It's like the 10% of the iceberg above surface. In many respects, the CPUSA is also show business to deceive and to distract any potential threat to the communist conspiracy. But the CPUSA has a purpose, and it is important to understand it. For all of its existence, it has had 3 major areas of activity: peace, civil rights, and poverty. Except that the communists mean something quite different than most of us mean when we use these words. Peace to a communist means the absence of opposition. We mean, usually, the absence of conflict. That's a big difference. Peace will come in communist terms when there's no opposition to communism. Civil rights to a communist doesn't mean what most people who use that term mean. Civil rights to a communist means class struggle. It means divide and conquer. Communists successfully divided China, peasant versus landlord, and then Algeria, French-speaking versus Muslim, and they brought communism to these countries. In Canada, the so-called separatist movement of the French versus the English-speaking Canadians is a communist-fueled class struggle. In our own country, it has largely been racial, but it is also male versus female, and of course now, young versus old. Finally, poverty to a communist doesn't mean help the poor, but instead organize the poor into a proletarian revolution. That's who the poor are, the proletariat. In October 1965, an amazing thing happened regarding all of this. When you want to know what the party is doing, you simply read party publications. They're available. One of the communist publications is the World Marxist Review. In October 1965, an article appeared entitled "Communists and the Mass Movements," written by top American communist Henry Winston. What the article said, in effect, was that all of the comrades should now combine all of their efforts in the area of peace, civil rights, and poverty into a united front under the banner of poverty. Right away, all the wheels began to turn. The peace groups started being against the war not because it was war, but because poor people had to fight the war. The civil rights groups began to talk about the oppressed poor instead of the oppressed black. And of course, the poverty people had no change at all to make. The admittedly communist groups changed their tactics much more quickly than the so-called non-communist groups. But in time, all of the non-communists, the sympathizers and the dupes, switched as well. Sane and Women's Strike for Peace and others were soon talking about the poor. To give you an example of the switch from civil rights, consider the fact that for the last year he was alive, Martin Luther King wasn't a leader of the civil rights movement at all. He was a leader of the poor. He was killed leading a garbage strike in Memphis, Tennessee. And his successor, Ralph Abernathy, rarely, if ever, uses the term civil rights. He's a leader of the poor. He led the so-called Poor People's March on Washington. And he travels the country wearing biv overalls, trying to convince people of his own poverty. He even leads a dumb mule around as part of his act. I believe that he knows that he's carrying out communist plans and purposes. I think he knows it just as much as I think Martin Luther King knew it. They both knew it at least from the time in September of 1957 when they attended the school run by communists at which these photographs were taken. Why do you suppose all of this emphasis was put on poverty? Let's return to the October 1965 World Marxist Review. Communist Henry Winston says it all. He said in that article, Today, the Economic Opportunity Act, and that's the poverty program, has already become the basis for organizing in the slums and ghetto communities, and it offers the point of departure for helping to rally the rank and file millions into a mass movement. And then, of course, the federal government had already created a war on poverty. The Economic Opportunity Act set up the Office of Economic Opportunity, the OEO, which is the war on poverty. This is the final green line from the U.S. government. Who gets the money? The poor or the organizers of the poor? Of course, the organizers of the poor get the money to finance insurrection and rioting and looting. As communist Henry Winston said, the war on poverty will help the communists to rally the rank and file millions into a mass movement. And who are the poverty officials across the country? In New York City, identified communists like Robert Schrank and Jesse Gray are war on poverty veterans. In Louisville, Kentucky, Ann Braden, who with husband Carl represent two of the top communists in the South. Ann Braden is a paid poverty official. If it's not identifiable communists who receive the funds, then it's black militants like Leroy Jones in Newark, Fred Brooks in Nashville, Bobby Seale in San Francisco. In Chicago, the Blackstone Rangers received a grant of $927,000 of poverty funds. Ladies and gentlemen, the awful fact of the matter is that the war on poverty is another war on the American people by the American government. It must be stopped if this nation is to survive. Its promoters will always trot out some case history of an individual who has been helped while they cover up the real purpose of the OEO. Even if this program does seem to help a few, at very best it's socialism. In time, the program would devour everyone's freedom. But the OEO is downright subversion going on daily right in our midst. The recipients of the funds or the beneficiaries of the funds are the militants, the anarchists, and those who riot and loot and burn and threaten. We're all too familiar with the large-scale violence that has plagued our nation. If you could ask one of these militants what he's attempting to do, he'd tell you that he's trying to overthrow the government. They're very frank about it. Let me make an assessment here of all this activity that may sound like a contradiction. I claim that there is not one slightest chance in the world that all of the revolutionary activity in our country is going to overthrow the government. There's no chance because this is not what it's all about. Do you think that the leaders in Washington would finance the leaders in the streets if it meant their overthrow? Of course not. One thing you can be sure of, the people who supply the money are not stupid. Well then, what really is going on? Simply stated, the revolutionaries in the streets provide the excuse for the seizure of more and more power by the federal government. More and more government eventually leads to total government. And that's totalitarianism, the rule of many by the few. Let me stress this point by saying it again. The American people are being provided with total government as an inescapable alternative to the violence in the streets. There's a name written here, Jan Kozak. Jan Kozak was a Czechoslovakian communist who was very instrumental in helping communism to seize that country. Kozak had a technique for accomplishing this, which is now called revolutionary parliamentarianism. This technique amounted to combining pressure from above with pressure from below, which forces the elected representatives to vote the country into total government. The technique was so successful that Kozak became an instructor in communist schools. One of his textbooks was obtained and has been distributed by the House Committee on Un-American Activities. It has also been reprinted in this form in the book called And Not a Shot is Fired. The way it works is to have some piece of legislation introduced into the Parliament or the Congress. The communists can always get legislation introduced. Then the pressure from above and the pressure from below is applied to the legislators, forcing them to vote for more government. Let's recognize something about elected officials right now. We should recognize it because the enemies of our nation certainly do. It is that most of those who represent us after being elected are not statesmen. They are politicians. And a politician's chief goal in the office he holds is simply to stay in office or go higher. He'll do anything that's necessary to stay there. He's therefore a setup for pressure groups, and he operates without conviction. We may wish this wasn't so, that those whom we send to represent us were all statesmen who vote with principle every time. But realistically speaking, we're at the mercy of politicians, and we probably always will be. When the conspiracy wants something from Congress, it simply cranks up the pressure. The mobs scream, the The militants warn, if you don't pass this law, this city will burn. And then there are demonstrations and confrontations and threats. And then the pressure from above comes from presidential commissions and establishment newspapers and columnists. The TV newscasters and the analysts also promote the cause, and soon everyone seems to be in favor of what is called a civil rights bill or some additional federally funded program. You're just an ordinary citizen. You know that this latest piece of socialism is harmful, but your newspaper is for it, the big-name columnist promotes it, you turn on the TV and you see the mobs chanting for it, and then the TV analyst tells you that we've got to have it to keep the violence from occurring. And so you're whipped. You think everyone's gone crazy, and you think you're all alone, which was just what was intended. And if they can beat you, how much easier your congressman who wants to stay in office. And so the vote goes the way the conspiracy wants, and we get more government. Our real threat isn't from the violent overthrow of government. The real enemy is totalitarianism, imposed gradually, so that few are aware of it, and these few can't stop it. What it boils down to is that the building of socialism is the communist revolution in America. The political process I just described is going on all the time, and it is working to build total government right here in our country. But an appreciation of what is happening will also show us a solution to the problem that's confronting us. If pressure from the left can cause politicians to vote for socialism, why not pressure from the Americanist point of view to reverse the trend and to rebuild our republic? If pressure can cause politicians to go one way, more pressure from the opposite point will bend them back the other way. So what is needed is an educational campaign to create an informed electorate. An informed electorate will make politicians anti-communists, conservatives, pro-Americans, patriots. This is what is already happening in some places in our country. Keep in mind that the difference between a politician and a statesman is that the statesman thinks about the next generation and the politician thinks about the next election. The best word to describe a politician is mugwump. You know what a mugwump is. A mugwump is a fellow who sits on a fence with his mug on one side and his wump on the other. The American system of government was designed with three branches, the legislative, executive, and judicial. Each was given specific responsibilities and limited powers. One of the key features of our system was to have each branch check the unwarranted growth and assuming of excessive power by the other. This whole philosophy has been called the system of checks and balances. We've all heard and used the term. The legislative branch was to check the executive, and the judicial is supposed to check the other two, and so on. We still pay lip service today to this important principle in our country, but for all intents and purposes, it doesn't exist anymore. Just take a look at the huge bureaucracy run by the executive branch, and you'll see how powerful they've become. Let me illustrate what has happened. I have a small Senate Internal Security Subcommittee report here entitled Interlocking Subversion in Government Departments. This was a summary report based on a large collection of testimony and research. It carries the date of July 30th, 1953. The subcommittee was chaired by Senator William Jenner of Indiana. Right here on page 3, the report carries a bold headline that says, 2 Soviet rings not exposed. The text goes on to discuss the known existence of 4 Soviet espionage rings operating within our government and the fact that only 2 of these rings were exposed. The first of 12 conclusions made by this subcommittee reads as follows. The Soviet International Organization has carried on a successful and important penetration of the United States government, and this penetration has not been fully exposed. Each of the other conclusions is equally startling. This was 1953. A United States Senate subcommittee charged with the responsibility to watch the executive branch learned of Soviet spies within that branch and reported their discoveries to the American people. But from then until now, there have been no further exposures of communists in government. Why not? You would certainly think that these senators at least would pursue the matter, wouldn't you? Here's what happened. During this same period, another senator was actively seeking to expose subversion in government. This was Senator Joseph R. McCarthy. Senator McCarthy's efforts were through the Government Operations Committee, of which he was the chairman in 1953. McCarthy had already demonstrated that he meant to expose communists in government, and he was doing just that. Early in 1954, he was investigating the Defense Department's installation at Fort Monmouth in New Jersey. He found communists.
This was the famous Army versus McCarthy controversy. He also found that there were important leaders of our own government who were trying to protect communists and block his efforts to expose them. McCarthy learned of a closed-door, high-level session in Washington that had been held for the specific purpose of stopping McCarthy. The meeting was held in the office of Attorney General Herbert Brownell. Top presidential assistant Sherman Adams was there, along with Henry Cabot Lodge, then the ambassador to the United Nations. Also present was a deputy attorney general named William P. Rogers, President Nixon's Secretary of State. When McCarthy got wind of what was going on in high places, he did what I would hope all men in such a position would do. He took his searchlight from the Communist Party and he shifted it to the seat of government itself. He demanded to know why high officials in government were interested in stopping an investigation of subversion into our own government. And although McCarthy had been a severe thorn in the flesh of the insiders and had been calling attention to embarrassing situations, when he went after the big shots themselves, he had to be destroyed. And with him, any potential for congressional exposure of subversion in government. The means used to stop McCarthy was a letter from President Eisenhower addressed to the Secretary of Defense, dated May 17, 1954. It directed the Secretary of Defense to instruct his personnel not to cooperate with Senator McCarthy's investigation. However, this letter effectively put a stop to all congressional investigations of the executive branch of government. From that day forward, government personnel refused to testify, to supply documents, or to cooperate in any way at all with investigations. From May 17, 1954 until today, there have been no investigations of the government by the duly commissioned representatives we send to Washington to perform that function. In 1960, a congressman from California studied the effect of the Eisenhower letter, and he showed that the letter had been cited better than 40 times to withhold information from Congress and the public. In my considered opinion, if President Eisenhower had done nothing else in his entire career but simply issue that one letter, he deserves the full repudiation of the American people. We know that there were communists in government as far back as 1953. The U.S. Senate Internal Security Subcommittee told us. We can conclude one of a number of things about these communists. That they stopped being communists, that they died or resigned and did not replace themselves, or that they continued to be communists, and that they brought men of like mind into influential positions in our government whenever possible, and that they are still there. I think the history of the past 2 decades suggests that they are still there and operating far more effectively to destroy our country. If you or I wish to investigate the State Department or the Health, Education, and Welfare Department or any department, we can't do it ourselves. We're supposed to ask our congressmen and our senators to do it. But if we ask them today, they'd tell us that they can't, or that they see no reason to. What they really mean is that they won't. During the campaign of 1968, Richard Nixon promised to investigate the State Department, but he hasn't. And as a result, the already gigantic federal bureaucracy grows and grows, and total government is staring us in the face. An important lesson to be learned by anyone who would oppose this conspiracy is that any effective opposition to it must be directed at the insiders, not at their Communist Party. If you want to be effective, you must fight the covert, not the overt. You must direct your attention and exposure to the bottom of the check. When McCarthy did that, they had to destroy him. They hounded him to his grave in 1957, and they've continued to hound him ever since. He was a distinct threat to the whole conspiracy. Of Joseph McCarthy, I like to say, once there was a man, God give us more. Let me make the same point another way. You can't fight this conspiracy and remain respectable in the eyes of the mass media. If you fight just the Communist Party, you will be respectable, but ineffective. Oh, the party won't like you, but the establishment media will produce an aura of credibility for you. The establishment media promotes Communist Party opponents as experts and responsible anti-communists, while the real opposition to the communist conspiracy is paraded before the public as extremists, reckless fanatics, and the lunatic fringe. What a sincere opponent of the conspiracy must do is continue to tell the truth and direct his attention to the bottom of the check. Don't ever expect to fight the enemy and have him like it. Senator McCarthy was one single individual fighting an entrenched and organized conspiracy. He posed a significant threat because of his strategic position as a United States Senator. But he never did organize, and because he was alone, he was successfully stopped. Had he organized Americans into a knowledgeable educational army, I think he would have exposed the whole mess. This is precisely why the John Birch Society has been formed as an educational army of knowledgeable citizens. Let's look deeper now into the conspiracy. We discussed the seizure of Russia by communists in 1917. And while there are many who sincerely believe that communism started then, we must go back further. We find that Lenin and Trotsky tried in 1905 to do what they accomplished doing in 1917. If we go back further in history, we'll find communist uprisings in European nations, such as the bloody riots in Paris in 1872, with the setting up of communards and the death of over 25,000 people. Further back, we see actual communist revolts in most of the nations of Europe in 1848. 1848 was the year when the Communist Manifesto was published, and the use of the word communism became common. What was the Communist Manifesto? It was simply a plan to follow if you wanted to conquer a nation from within. If you could implement the Communist Manifesto in any nation, you will have power in that nation. The manifesto has 10 major planks. It is very important to realize that 2 of the 10 were imposed on us in 1913 by the Wilson administration. These were the graduated income tax and the control of banking and currency through the Federal Reserve. In other words, we went 20% of the way toward communism prior to the seizure of Russia by communists in 1917. The Communist Manifesto was, of course, written by Karl Marx. He was employed by a group called the League of Just Men. To give you an idea of what this organization was all about, the League of Just Men changed its name to the Communist League after the publication of Marx's manifesto. But obviously we have to go back further. Who or what was the League of Just Men? We go back, and for purposes of continuity in history, we stop in 1776 in one of the most amazing coincidences in all history. Not to July 4th and our Declaration of Independence, but to May 1st of 1776. On this day, a conspiracy to rule the world called the Illuminati was established in Bavaria by a man named Adam Weishaupt. Weishaupt had coalesced into a single organization the existing conspiracies of the day. His brilliance was obvious in just the organization of the Illuminati, with concentric circles of power, influence, and knowledge of the ultimate goal. This enabled the conspiracy to use the energies and talents of many who knew not for whom or for what they were laboring. The goals of the Illuminati have been summarized as follows: the obliteration of Christianity, the deification of sensuality, the repudiation of marriage and the state adoption of children, the destruction of private property, the renunciation of all religion, universal license, and the wrecking of civilization by destruction of all governments and the merging of all the people of the earth under a world government. It should be obvious that this program is the communist program today. The Illuminati succeeded very quickly in penetrating the academic communities at the universities in Germany. They succeeded in infiltrating and then taking over for their purposes the Masonic orders in France. The Illuminati was largely responsible for the French Revolution and the terror from which France has never really recovered. In 1798, the Illuminati were exposed by an Englishman named John Robison, who, after a great deal of study, published a book called Proofs of a Conspiracy. In the same year, a French priest named the Abbé Baruel published a scholarly 4-volume work exposing the Illuminati. And in our own country, President George Washington wrote to friends not only of the existence of the Illuminati, but of its potential threat to our own country. Because of the exposure, the Illuminati went even further underground. There is certainly a possibility that it went completely out of existence. But what has happened in the succeeding years leads me to suspect that the Illuminati, or something else exactly the same under a different name, still exists. Toward the middle and latter half of the 1800s, as we go back up now in history, we see the emergence of many new isms, all with a goal of world power. These were communism, socialism, nihilism, anarchism, syndicalism, which would be taking power through the labor movement. It is my belief that these isms were begun or caused to be begun by the Illuminati for the purpose of carrying out their goals under a different banner. In 1917, communism became the first of the isms to seize control of a physical base of operations. Communism very rapidly rose to such a preeminent position within the conspiracy that today it is known as the communist conspiracy. But in order to understand what has happened, we must be aware that communism is only a tool of the total conspiracy. Communism is merely a means to world rule for a group of brilliant criminals who have no loyalty to any economic, political, or social ideology. Their only loyalty is to themselves. There are some who wish to debate whether the Illuminati exists today. I don't believe that the name of the group really matters. Neither does the provable traceability of today's conspiracy to 1776. What does matter is the presence of a tightly knit organization using the tactics and having the same goal as the Illuminati. It is interesting, though certainly not conclusive, to note the adoption of May 1st, the date of the founding of the Illuminati by Weishaupt in 1776, as the international holiday for socialists and communists the world over. And interesting, too, is the placement in 1935 of the Illuminati slogan, Novus Ordo Seclorum, New World Order, on the American dollar bill.
We realize that the very notion of a conspiracy above communism is completely new to most Americans. We certainly believe that this is the case and have been saying exactly this for many years. Some have examined our point of view and held back from complete acceptance for the simple reason that no one has ever defected from this grand conspiracy to tell us about it. Their argument has been, if this conspiracy exists, then it is reasonable to expect that someone at some time would defect from it and tell the world about it. There never was such a defector, as there certainly has been from the communist movement and other lesser conspiracies. This was true until recently. And now there is a source of information about this conspiracy from the inside. In 1966, Dr. Carroll Quigley wrote a lengthy book entitled Tragedy and Hope. Dr. Quigley is a professor of history who has spent most of his years at Harvard and Princeton and is now at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Tragedy and Hope is a history of this grand conspiracy. In this book, Dr. Quigley tells us of a secret network operating both here and in Europe to control the world. He details the role played by the Rothschilds and other banking families, the part played by the Council on Foreign Relations and its English equivalent, and the participation in this network of men like Edward Mandell House, the Dulles brothers, Walter Lippmann, and many others. Amazingly, however, Dr. Quigley does not tell us of this conspiracy because he opposes it. In fact, he thinks it's wonderful, and he is proud to be a part of it. In his book, he states, I know of the operations of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records. I have no aversion to it or to most of its aims and have, for much of my life, been close to it and to many of its instruments. I have objected, both in the past and recently, to a few of its policies. But in general, my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I believe its role in history is significant enough to be known. So says Dr. Quigley. Tragedy and Hope is, in fact, important corroboration for the thesis we have proposed. It is so important that Mr. W. Cleon Skousen has written a 130-page review and commentary of Quigley's amazing book. Mr. Skousen is a former official with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a former police chief, and a longtime student of this conspiracy. Rather than suggest to you that you struggle through the 1,300-page Tragedy and Hope, let me urge you to read The Naked Capitalist by Mr. Skousen. The insight it provides will help you to understand better what is happening to us so that you may be better equipped to do something about it.
What we are facing today is nothing more nor less than the long continuing struggle of the forces of good versus the forces of evil. Evil has always been organized, and the forces of evil have always used collectivism and amorality as the tools of tyranny. Today is no different. What do I think is at the root of this evil? Let me refer you to Robert Welch, a man in whom I have great confidence. He has repeatedly called our adversaries satanic and diabolic, and this is exactly what I mean. And so we are now out of the realm of politics and economics. We are now squarely in the area of morality. In truth, this is good versus evil and light versus darkness. It is a moral struggle, and it must be seen in that way if an individual means to persist in the fight. It is reasonable to ask how the conspiracy gets its recruits, and how it can get so many to do its will. Let's discuss the question of gaining recruits. We'll do it by detailing a case history of just one attempt to entice a young American into the conspiracy, and I think you'll see how they work. The subject of our example is a member of the John Birch Society today. He was a student at Harvard in the 30s. and he was one of the brightest men in his class. He found himself adopted by a professor who gave him extra attention, introduced him to many important people, and showed him many of the ropes. Our student was certainly most appreciative. Just prior to a summer vacation, the professor suggested to his prized pupil that he take a job in Washington among some really big people. In fact, the professor had already arranged an interview for him in Washington if he'd make the trip. Well, our student went to Washington and was interviewed. He was accepted for the position right away also. Before he agreed to take it, however, he wanted to think it over a little bit further. When he got back to Harvard, he sought out his professor and told him that he decided to pass up the job. In effect, he said, "Thanks, but no thanks." The professor was livid, and his extreme reaction startled the student. But the student did go home to California and did not go to Washington. When he returned to Harvard the next fall, the professor ignored him. No more extra attention, no more friendliness. In fact, our student had been dropped like the proverbial hot potato. He couldn't understand why in light of the previous excessive attention. About 15 years later, however, he did find out why, when he learned that the man with whom he had interviewed in Washington was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury Harry Dexter White, who had just been identified as a communist. What had happened was that our student had been invited into the conspiracy, had refused, and so they dropped him. The conspiracy looks for self-promoters. I don't know what caused our student to turn down such an obviously good opportunity. Perhaps to be with family, a girlfriend, or maybe even something frivolous. The important thing to the conspiracy was that he was not possessed of all-consuming ambition, and so they weren't interested in him. What they are interested in are those who will put aside other considerations, especially moral ones, in pursuit of money, power, and influence. So you see, moral principle is the enemy of the conspiracy. These men have already seized top echelons in practically every field. They can make you if you play according to their rules. And the temptation to a moral weakling is more than most can bear. If you are willing to put aside your moral convictions and the eternal truths, you are a potential recruit for the conspiracy. If you will now stop for a moment to realize that this is exactly what is happening all around us, you shouldn't be too shocked to discover the mess we're in. The businessman who says it's rough out there and you've got to play rough to get ahead. The politician who will do and say anything to get elected and stay elected. The young newspaper reporter who will knowingly perpetuate a false image of anti-communist activity in order to get his byline in the paper. The ordinary citizen whose sole motivation for activity is, what's in it for me? These are potential recruits for the conspiracy. And even if they never get to be formally a part of the conspiracy, they do the work of the enemy as they try. It is possible that we in the John Birch Society may have given a false impression of this conspiracy if we seem to be saying that the conspiracy is a gigantic computer-sized brain that, like a master puppeteer, has a string out to thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, and that it compels this one to do one thing and thousands to do others here, there, and all around the globe so that a desired goal can be reached. We do a disservice to our own cause. That is not precisely how it works. No one brain can accomplish all of that. The way the conspiracy works is to seize the influence-molding positions. It can then have these people, and I like to call them tone setters, let it be known what acts to perform, what attitudes to convey, and which individuals to promote. And then thousands and millions of self-promoters go to work to do the will of the conspiracy. There are definite strings out from the conspiracy to some disciplined minions, but not that many. Most of the conspiracy's work is done by non-conspirators who are simply promoting themselves. And so the connection between all these people and the conspiracy is not like a puppet to his puppeteer, not a string let down from above to each individual. The connection instead is a ladder put up from the bottom. And then all kinds of amoral individuals scramble all over each other as they promote themselves by doing the work of the conspiracy. Morality is the key in this struggle. Strong moral convictions are the only opposition to this kind of bait. If you asked Robert Welch today what was the most important significant problem we faced in the country, many would expect that he'd select the United Nations, or the war on poverty, or aid to the communists. But his answer to that question has always been moral decline. As morality goes down, fewer people are left to oppose evil. We like to think of the John Birch Society as something new in history. There's no precedent for what we are. For the first time, the good guys are organized, hopefully in time. Evil has always had organization, And though evil men and evil purposes have been recognized throughout history, the response has usually been, it can't happen here. And far from being an organization simply to ward off evil, the John Birch Society has been designed to live for hundreds of years. The positive promise of what we can build far outweighs the negative fear of what we must destroy. We look forward to the day when the defeat of the conspiracy's hold on our government will signal the beginning of an era of progress and goodwill unparalleled in history. There are those who assess our situation and conclude that all is lost. They say no nation has ever gone as far into collectivism as we in the United States already are and yet recovered. Surprisingly, they're right. Tyranny has always been the result of a slide into collectivism, and we are supposed to be past the point of no return. But there's something that these prophets of doom do not add to their evaluation. It is simply that, as far as can be determined, no one has ever really tried to reverse the collectivist drive. And so, while we recognize the truth in the fact that no nation or civilization has ever pulled out when they were as far along as we are, who's to say that we can't be a first? Do we give up, or do we try? We in the John Birch Society believe that the fight for freedom won't end until we give up. And we're not quitting, ever. How does the John Birch Society go about its work? This final chart says it pretty conclusively. The Society was founded in 1958 when Mr. Welsh talked to 11 men for 2 days. After analyzing the problems and the possible solution, he proposed an organization that would use education as its strategy and truth as its weapon. And so the John Birch Society was born. In slightly over 10 years, it has become by far the largest single force opposing the communist conspiracy in the entire world. The Society has a staff of close to 200 people, half of whom are field coordinators. These men cover the entire nation and spend all of their time organizing, recruiting, instructing, and helping in many ways to promote the goals of the Society. Our strategy includes the use of concerted action. We don't wish to scatter our efforts. I think it's safe to say that everyone in this audience has a pet peeve. If we wanted to, each of us could spend all of our time fighting in this one area. If we did, few, if any, would succeed. So what we in the John Birch Society do is accept the leadership of a man who has a tremendously deep understanding of the conspiracy. He tells us where the conspiracy is most vulnerable and how best to fight the fight. The bulletin of the John Birch Society carries a continuing agenda of projects which members are requested to work on each month. Let me amplify what can be accomplished by concerted action. If the American people could be made aware of the effect of aid and trade to communist nations, they'd put a stop to it. And if aid and trade to communists were stopped, the war in Vietnam would cease. The communist nations would fold, and the conspiracy's hold on our government would be broken. Sufficient exposure of just this one subject would accomplish defeating the conspiracy, so why go off on scattered projects? We don't put all our eggs in one basket, but we certainly don't scatter our efforts so much that there's little chance of accomplishing anything. To dispense our educational materials, we've been forced to create our own channels of communication. We have 2 magazines, American Opinion, the monthly, and Review of the News, a weekly. The circulation figures of these 2 magazines are not overwhelming, but reprints of articles from these publications, totaling several million copies, make these magazines very potent indeed. We have the largest speakers bureau in the United States, if not the world. Not much more needs to be said about that. Each of the speeches serves as an introduction to scores of newly awakened Americans, and the talks are heard all over the nation. Members of the John Birch Society operate a chain of American Opinion libraries and bookstores. These stores, owned and operated by members of the Society and their communities, help to distribute the anti-communist literature that we seek to bring before the American people. There are approximately 400 of these stores now, and more are opening all the time. The Society produces and distributes films and film strips on foreign policy, domestic turmoil, and other important topics. Even more important, we obtain audiences for them. These also serve as a significant introduction to the entire problem. We publish our own books in order to present solid information to anyone who'll read it. The Fearful Master on the United Nations contained in this packet. It's very simple on civil rights, and dozens of paperback books of the past that we've brought back. And we have formed ad hoc committees. Sometimes people insist on calling these organizations front groups. We're aware that the communists form front groups, but we insist on calling ours ad hoc committees. The most significant difference is that a communist front group conceals its ultimate goal and the fact that it's communist. Our ad hoc committees operate openly and forthrightly, and no one is ever asked to endorse or join one without knowing that the John Birch Society is behind it. Many people who get involved with one of our committees do end up in the John Birch Society. Certainly, some prefer just the limited activity in the committee. We have trained to restore American independence now, which is concerned with foreign policy. We have tact, truth about civil turmoil, concerned with the domestic problems. We have support your local police committees. We like to stress that the emphasis is on the word local. We want no national police force because a synonym for national police force is Gestapo. We are especially concerned about federal aid to police forces because it is certain that what the federal government finances, it will eventually control. Our newest ad hoc committee is the Movement to Restore Decency, MOTOREAD. And isn't this needed? This is a campaign to halt the moral tailspin we are in and to begin to bring decency and morality back into prominence. MOTOREAD has been very active in the drive to combat sex education in the schools, pornography, drug abuse, sensitivity training, and the beginning of government control of population. At the end of the founding meeting, Robert Welch said, "All we must find and build and use to win is sufficient understanding." That says it all. We need more people to take up this fight in many more communities across the country. If you'd like, you can consider this as an open invitation to join the John Birch Society. If you're ready, we'd love to have you join us. But perhaps you're not convinced. Or, looking at it another way, perhaps we haven't proven to you what has obviously been proven to us. We operate with the full realization that individuals require varying amounts of evidence to convince them of the truth of a thesis. Possibly you need more evidence. If you do, I'm sure that the people who are showing you this film have other films that they'd like to show you also. I'd expect that your host will invite you to see more of these films. If he doesn't, then you ask him to do so yourself. And then take advantage of the opportunity to see the films and do it soon. And in between the films, read some of the printed evidence that these folks have available for you. There are $1 packets or books on practically every subject touched on this evening. These are all available for you to take with you. Let me try to stimulate you to want to read some of the material with this short little epigram that I learned from a self-educated policeman. I liked it so much that I made a sign out of it. It says, "Those who will not read have no advantage over those who cannot read." In closing, let me remind all of the moral obligation to oppose evil. And let me reluctantly add that your responsibility, because you are an American, is greater than that of a citizen from another country. Because it is our government that is now the chief promoter of this conspiracy, our responsibilities are double. And because we are the heirs of Americanism, we owe it to the future to preserve it, to protect it, and to help others to enjoy its fruits. The challenge is there, the opportunity for good is there, and the need is certainly there. So, let's go to work. Thank you. May God bless you and inspire you all, and may God bless America.